there's the top level, which is how the brain does most of its business. And that is like a computer. The brain, you have on-off on the computer. You have on-off in the brain. You have on is a chemical called glutamate, and off is a chemical called GABA, and those two switch and control each other. And then under that, you have neurotransmitters, chemicals which people will have heard of.
Serotonin, dopamine.
Exactly.
No, exactly.
And we call them modulators. So they add color and texture and meaning to the on-off. And then underneath that, you have things like hormones, like endorphins, like cortisol, and they give oxytocin. They give much longer-lasting impacts on the brain. Or before, there were organisms that had more than one cell. In those single-cell organisms, GABA was being made, and glutamate was being made, and they made from each other. And what happened is that when we started to develop the ability to release chemicals, organisms began to release GABA and glutamate. And they're very similar molecules. And then the organisms developed receptors that were selective for each. But when they were making this gabapentin to look like GABA, it turns out it was actually a little bit more like glutamate, because those two molecules are very, very similar.
Very similar.
Yeah. So for the first time, we were able to look into the brain of someone who was having a trip. And it was mind-blowing. What we saw was mind-blowing. Their minds were being blown. But we thought mind expansion, the experience, would be associated with increased activity. But it wasn't. It was decreased activity. But it was decreased activity in a very special network in the brain. And it was that made us think, wow, maybe we could treat disorders like depression where there's overactivity of that network.
Exactly.
And so actually the resurrection of the clinical work came as a result of the science.
Bună seara tuturor, suntem din nou la podcastul lui Damian Draghici și așa cum de fiecare dată v-am promis, aduc de fiecare dată oameni foarte, foarte speciali, oameni dedicați, oameni care fac cu totul și cu totul lucruri speciale. De data aceasta voi avea un invitat incredibil de special. Pentru mine este un geniu în ceea ce face. Îl cheamă David Nutt, este profesor of neuroscience și pharmacology în UK și am mare onoare să vorbim cu el despre psihedelice, despre creier, mental health, depresie, anxietate și tot ce înseamnă, cum spun eu, plantele viitorului, care sunt ale noastre, de fapt, ale lumii. Mulțumesc mult celor de la Kaufland pentru susținere și vă mulțumesc vouă pentru toată susținerea. Doamne ajută, vă mulțumesc mult. Am onoarea să-l introduc pe David Nutt. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
So, professor of neuroscience and pharmacology. Please define it.
Well, neuroscience is the study of the brain, and pharmacology is the study of drugs, and I bring the two together. And the reason for that is that the brain is actually a chemical or pharmacological organ. The sophistication of the brain is given by the fact that communication between nerves in the brain, we call them neurons, is made through chemicals, not electricity. And so the brain is a chemical machine, and to study chemicals, you need other chemicals we call drugs.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Tell me how this passion of yours started from a very young age.
Yes, well, I started off wanting to be a scientist. And then I decided I wanted to be a brain scientist because the brain is very interesting compared with other organs. I went to university thinking I would do electrical work on the brain. I was fascinated by the first data showing that you could treat opiate withdrawal by putting electrodes in the ear.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's amazing. Wow, a little bit of electricity here and people stop having the shakes, etc. But when I went to university, I went to Cambridge University, my tutor was discovering that the brain was a chemical machine. He was discovering the chemistry of the brain. And then I thought, wow, that's much more important. Electricity is important, but chemistry is what actually turns brain cells on and off. So then I moved to doing the pharmacology.
So you've been doing this for how many years?
Well, I started studying in 1969, so
Oh my God,
a very long time ago.
Yeah.
It was 50 years.
So you're a pioneer in this world. As people are saying, I'm not a specialist in neuroscience. I'm just a musician, but I'm really, really very passionate about the subject, and I'm reading about, and this is my passion. People were saying until about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that we know only about 3 or 5% about the brain, that we are not very well informed about the brain.
Yes,
so what's your opinion about this?
We've moved on a bit. Yes, although it's still quite strange. There are still genes. The brain is making substances that we know that are genes, but we don't know what the chemistry of them is. We don't know what they're making. So there's still unknowns in the brain. But we do have a much better idea of how the brain is organized than we did all those years ago. And we do have a pretty good knowledge of the different levels of chemistry and pharmacology in the brain. And really there are three. There's the top level, which is how the brain does most of its business. And that is like a computer. The brain, you have on-off on the computer. You have on-off in the brain. You have on is a chemical called glutamate, and off is a chemical called GABA, and those two switch and control each other. And then under that, you have neurotransmitters, chemicals which people will have heard of. More.
Serotonin, dopamine.
Exactly.
No, exactly.
And we call them modulators. So they add color and texture and meaning to the on-off. And then underneath that, you have things like hormones, like endorphins, like cortisol,
Oxytocin.
and they give oxytocin. They give much longer-lasting impacts on the brain.
I've been always mesmerized by that, and years ago I went myself personally to Dr. Amen in the States. He's the guy that has in Anaheim the MRI with the ink, and he can see the activity of the brain. And if you had any brain injury, or if you ever consume drugs or something, he can see the holes within the brain. Mm-hmm. And because from a young kid I was considered having a really huge dose of ADHD, mm-hmm. and that was the moment before that, even that I was seeing and learning about serotonin, dopamine, and all that trend of the 2000s, if you remember, also in UK, in the States, where functional medicine, they were talking constantly about tryptophan and the 5-HTP, tryptophan and 5-HTP to eat as much and to get as much. What I've realized in the last years, reading Dr. Mark Hyman and all the specialists, is that actually the brain, and I've done also an experiment on myself. After I've heard from Jordan Peterson that he did a carnivore diet, and I did about 3 years ago although I was vegan for many years, which is not so good for the brain.
No, that is true.
Exactly. I did about 90 days, 3 months, I did the carnivore diet, eating ribeye. And funny enough, I was craving even more the fat from the ribeye. Yeah. And that was for the first time in my life where I was not craving sugar, carbs or anything. My depression was gone, my anxiety was gone, and my ADHD was gone.
Interesting.
And that was for the first time that I realized that the brain doesn't need actually glucose, needs fats.
Indeed it does.
Although my liver always produces a lot of cholesterol, which means it's a lot of activity in the brain. That's why it needs so much cholesterol. So I would like you to develop a bit about this before we go to the psychedelics.
Sure. Well, I think you've discovered something that we have kind of known for a long time, but not from the same perspective. So if you go back to the war and you look at people who are starved in concentration camps, and you look at what they most craved, well, actually the thing they most craved was cigarettes.
Yes.
But if you couldn't get cigarettes, they crave fat more than carbohydrate. And now no one really understood why that was, but we do now, because what the fat is essential for the building up and the security of those nerve cells. And so that's the first thing that you discovered.
Exactly.
But the second thing you discovered is that proteins contain amino acids, and amino acids make transmitters like serotonin and dopamine. And so a high protein diet makes it easier for your brain to make those important neurotransmitters. Now, I didn't know about treating ADHD with a high protein diet. That is interesting. But I do know that one of the things we try to do in people with depression is to make sure they don't starve themselves, because starving depletes the brain of serotonin.
Exactly. And I've seen it also on myself. I've done in the last year, about 7 times, once every 2 months. I've done the 7 days water fast, just water fast. Not so much for weight loss. In the beginning for weight loss, then more for the spiritual and emotional equilibrium, balance. But I would have to say that after a while, you become extremely focused, you are really present. But in terms of the brain, immediately after you finish, while you are on the fast, you crave, the only things that you crave are vegetables and fruits. Yeah. But once you finish the fast, you need fat like crazy.
Right.
Because it's like the starving and the...
Yes. Well, that's right. Well, I mean, it's... So the brain is a fatty chemical organ,
exactly.
I would say.
Exactly. It's a fat guy. GABA, it's so important for us. Right. There is also the GABA as a form, as a supplement. Yes. And some of them, the ones from GNC, I know that it gets over the brain barrier. Some of it doesn't go over it.
Some of it doesn't, you're quite right.
Exactly.
Yes.
I was also for a while from Dr. Amen years ago on Gabapentin in order to lower my...
Interesting.
To lower
and that worked?
I don't know if it worked. As I remember, usually the Gabapentin usually was made for people with epilepsy.
Correct.
And then they started doing it for anxiety.
Yep. But it although it's called Gabapentin, it was made to be for GABA. It turns out it's actually more against glutamate.
Okay.
And it's a really interesting reason for that. Why is glutamate the on switch of the brain and GABA the off switch? Because a long time before we had brains, or before there were organisms that had more than one cell, in those single cell organisms, GABA was being made and glutamate was being made, and they made from each other. And what happened is that when we started to develop the ability to release chemicals, organisms began to release GABA and glutamate. And they're very similar molecules. And then the organisms developed receptors that were selective for each. But when they were making this gabapentin to look like GABA, it turns out it was actually a little bit more like glutamate, because those two molecules are very, very similar.
Very similar.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I've seen in the last years, of course, people they are searching and they are trying to find any type of things. Like in the last 20 years, let's say, I remember it was always the most present, except the 5-HTP, tryptophan, St. John's wort, valerian root, passion flower.
Yes.
Now, the last 10 years, the trend became like ashwagandha, lemon balm, L-theanine, magnesium glycinate, magnesium L-threonate, in order to calm the brain, in order to feel... and all this, it became like a trend in the world of the supplements. Mm-hmm. In order to regulate the mood and to regulate the anxiety. Are people using too much of this supplement, trying to find this quiet, rather than doing activities like, I don't know, Zen Buddhism or yoga or other things that could make them be present and be in the now?
Well, what you do is largely driven by what you know and how much time you have. So I don't think there's any doubt if you can become trained in Zen or become trained in meditation or mindfulness, or then it's a good way of helping control anxiety. But for most of us, our work pressures, our domestic pressures don't allow that. And so then, supplements do have a role, I think.
Now, the next level would be I've known about, I was in the States about 24 years ago, and I had a friend of mine from Canada that he was quite a genius. I met him when I was at Berklee College of Music in Boston, Kevin Butt from Canada, and he introduced me at the time to NLP and to the work of Erickson and Richard Bandler, exactly. And really, really smart guy, progressive guy. And then about 4 years later, he wrote me an email that he went on a trip to, we're talking about like 99, 25 years ago. He went on a trip to Peru and he did ayahuasca. And he wrote me all these things that he'd seen his friend that he was dead, and I was like, oh my God, this guy, he's really with his brains out there. And I let it go for many years, although I was in circles around being a musician. You know, musicians, they're always around people with mushrooms, ayahuasca, and all type of things, especially in the States. And then 2017-18 came when Michael Pollan released the book.
Yes, brilliant book.
I was familiar with Terence McKenna and with the McKenna brothers, and I was familiar with all this, Paul Stamets. But then the psilocybin, it became like the magical mushroom for depression. Now, please tell us about this magic power that Earth, God, the universe gave us, and also please extend the answer to what happened in the late 1960s, at the end of the 1960s, where the administration, Nixon, made Timothy Leary the public enemy #1, and Ram Dass, and
absolutely,
exactly, they made this impossible to be around, and they put in the market the big pharma, Xanax and all the other stuff.
Yes, yeah, it's the saddest story, I think, in the history of science. So in the 60s, and starting in the 50s with LSD, and then a few years later, the discovery that psilocybin was also similar to LSD in structure and function. And both of those were made available as a medicine by Sandoz, the drug company that Albert Hofmann worked for. And he made the discovery of LSD, and then he discovered psilocybin was also similar. There was an enormous amount of interest, because in those days, we didn't have any treatments of psychiatry. All we could do was sedate people, or dampen them with morphine, or tie them down, as you say, tie them up with straitjackets. And psychedelics actually made the field of psychiatry, because we could explore the brain, we could change the brain and heal people. And it was an absolute revolution, and there were hundreds of studies done, 1,000 clinical papers published, 40,000 patients were studied. And then they got banned. And they got banned because of two things. They got banned because the war in Vietnam was going badly,
and nobody wanted to fight.
People didn't want to fight,
exactly.
And then some of those people were taking LSD and saying, I definitely don't want to fight now. And they were saying things like, make love, not war, or drop acid, not bombs. And that was such a threat to the American way of doing politics and diplomacy that the Americans decided they had to ban the drugs. They couldn't ban protests against the Vietnam, but they banned the drugs. And of course, the war in Vietnam then ended, but the drugs have not been unbanned. It's almost impossible to unban a drug. There's always someone that wants to keep it controlled.
So they block all these things on that famous list of drugs.
They blocked them. And well, what was worse, and this was a really cruel thing, is they could have just made them illegal in the same way as morphine's illegal.
Yes.
But no, they didn't make them. They put them in a special class.
Yes, they criminalized them, exactly.
And they said they had no medical value when they had medical value. They said they were very dangerous when they weren't. And they said they were addictive when they're not. They're anti-addictive. So they lied about them to a point where everyone believed the lies. And that's why 55 years on, there's still no country in the world has made them legal. Even though, now we can research them, but it's difficult because of the regulations are intense. It's much, for me to study psilocybin, I have to have a special safe bolted to the wall, bolted to the floor, with a camera to make sure I'm not going in there stealing the psilocybin. And I say to bureaucrats, well, why can't I just keep my psilocybin next to the heroin in the pharmacy?
Which is much safer.
And they say, exactly. And they say, no, because it's Schedule 1. And of course, that is just completely
ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. But we're fighting back. And we're fighting back, initially, through pharmacology. When I started working in this field, I didn't really know much about the historical use. I was just interested in what the nature was of the psychedelic experience, because it clearly is a hugely profound experience. It changed.
Very, very mystical.
Well, that's right. And it changed. We knew about people like Huxley and Leary. It was changing the way people thought about things. And I was getting towards the end of my career, and I thought, well, if I don't study it now, I'll never do it. And what was really completely unexpected was just doing the brain imaging. So for the first time, we were able to look into the brain of someone who was having a trip. And it was mind-blowing. What we saw was mind-blowing. Their minds were being blown. But we thought mind expansion, the experience, would be associated with increased activity. But it wasn't. It was decreased activity. But it was decreased activity in a very special network in the brain. And it was that made us think, wow, maybe we could treat disorders like depression where there's overactivity of that network.
Exactly.
And so actually the resurrection of the clinical work came as a result of the science.
Incredible. So you, Griffiths at John Hopkins. Exactly. The guys from MAPS again,
yes, right.
Dublin.
Yeah.
I mean, you've been sitting on this for the last 50 years, and only in the last 10 years you came back. Yes. So for so many years, it must have been very difficult for you to know about this, that this can save lives, and you're not able to break the wall.
It's terrible. I mean, it's the worst censorship. I've done a little calculation. Let's just take alcoholism, right? Now, back in the 1960s, a lot of people don't know this. Even people who go to Alcoholics Anonymous don't know this. The man who founded Alcoholics Anonymous was called Bill Wilson.
Yes.
He cured his alcoholism through a psychedelic trip. And then in 1953, he took LSD with Huxley, and he realized that LSD could help alcoholics get the experience he'd had. And he effectively got the US government to fund 6 trials of a single dose of LSD to help people stay off alcohol. Now, 10 years ago, 2 Norwegians went back, they got all the source data, and they analysed it, and they showed that the effect size, the clinical effect of LSD, 1 dose, was 3 times bigger than any treatment we've had since. Now, I've calculated, since LSD was banned in 1968, 100 million people worldwide have died prematurely from alcoholism. Now, suppose LSD saved 10%, say. It probably did more, but let's just say conservatively.
At least 10%.
Yeah. So that's 10 million lives essentially prolonged because of LSD. How many lives have been saved by the ban on LSD? Well, probably none.
None.
But maybe 10, maybe 100, maybe 1,000. Even if you said 1 million, the equation is so in favour of the treatment, it's outrageous that we haven't had it. And that, as I say, it's the worst censorship of clinical treatment and research in the history of the world. Luckily, very soon, there's been a major study in America now showing it works in a classical trial, and there's going to be one more study, and I think maybe in a couple of years it'll be available as a medicine.
Yeah, they were saying that the MDMA with MAPS, maybe FDA approved, was supposed to be FDA approved about 2 years ago. They were saying the same thing, and I think Colorado and Portland, Oregon, they're already
right. So what's
legal.
happening in America is that mushrooms are being made available.
Exactly.
But when we do the clinical trials, we use the pure extract psilocybin. But what's happening, particularly in Oregon, is very fascinating, because there you have a big state that has voted to make available mushrooms for wellness, for well-being, to protect people from depression, protect people from addiction, and that is a massive transformation.
Yeah, I think the first step was the one with the ketamine, which was a good one, but ketamine is much lower. Yeah. And I think that the next step is this thing with the mushrooms and the psilocybin, which is going to be huge.
Yes. Now, but what we have to be careful of, and this is the worry, America led the way for medical cannabis. Okay.
Yes.
And now over 200 million Americans have access to medical cannabis. But it's still illegal under federal law. And that means the federal government is not allowed to fund research to tell us if medical cannabis is working.
Wow.
It's really stupid. So we're hoping they will change the regulations, because we need to know, the world needs it. When Oregon starts using in a widespread way mushroom therapy, we need to monitor and see how many
to see the results.
We need exactly.
Yeah. Colorado, I think it was open because also was the first state that decriminalized the weed.
That's right.
And also, it's always very trendy in terms of wellness and in terms of all this movement. If they've been trendy for the last 50 years. Yeah. I think I received an email about a few years ago where Peter Thiel, the guy from former guy from PayPal was involved, and some people from Silicon Valley were involved with a company from Oregon. They were trying to make psilocybin nasal spray, like there is the Spravato from
That's right,
ketamine.
The ketamine nasal spray. Yes.
Exactly, which will be amazing. I mean, just to have a couple of shots and to feel much better, kind of like a microdosing, but for really bad cases of anxiety and depression.
It might work. I mean, one of the paradoxes is that it's very hard to study microdosing because a microdose is still as illegal as a macrodose. A trip dose, they're all illegal. Even a molecule is illegal. But with microdose, you've got to give it repeatedly. So you have to have a license every time someone comes to have a microdose. You've got to have them in hospital. It makes microdosing studies are very much more expensive because you're using them on a daily basis instead of once off.
So and also with the microdose, it's all this about three days on, 5 days, 5 days on, 2 days off.
Different.
James Friedman? No, what's his name of the guy?
That's right. Fadiman.
Fadiman. Yeah, that's. I wrote to him an email about years ago, and he told me about it. Now, there is a difference between truffles, magic mushrooms, and the active compound, what you're calling about psilocybin. You extract exactly the psilocybin. What are the differences between the three of them? The ones that you use actually as a neuroscientist for the brain,
so we use psilocybin because we know exactly what we're getting. And the ethics committees insist that we're going to we give most people 25 milligrams of the pure powder. Okay. Magic mushrooms, there are 200 species of magic mushrooms all over the world. And they have different amounts of psilocybin in them. And some are big and some are small and some are really strong and some are quite weak. So it's quite difficult to know exactly how much psilocybin you have if you're taking a mushroom. Now, some companies, there's a company called Filament, which is taking the mushrooms and saying, okay, we're going to take out of the mushroom the psilocybin. So it's natural psilocybin rather than synthetic psilocybin.
Okay. Yours is synthetic?
Ours is synthetic, that's
okay.
Right. Then you come to the truffles. Now, the truffles are the part of the mushroom that lives under the ground. And we can have access to the truffles because the Dutch were very, very clever.
Yeah.
Because they said the new international conventions, the UN conventions, only ban the mushrooms. They don't ban the truffles. So they made truffles available.
So it's not about the roots, it's only about what grows up above the earth.
Yeah, so that's what they said. They basically challenged.
They found a glitch in the...
Exactly. They found a glitch in the UN conventions. And but it's also, obviously, not pure. There's other things in it. Now, that's interesting. And this is an area that we want to research. It's difficult to research, but there are people who believe quite strongly that the effect of the mushroom extract is better than the effect of the pure psilocybin. And that's possible because mushrooms make other things in the same way as we know that medical cannabis is better if you get the whole plant extract. Maybe medical psilocybin would be better if you got the whole mushroom extract.
Okay.
And there's some research in animals that show the extra other parts of the other chemicals in the mushrooms can have value. But no one's gone on to do that study in humans yet.
Now, I have to challenge myself to ask you this question. I've seen that. I'm a fan of Joe Rogan podcast, and I've seen the report Stamets, which is a huge mushroom. How shall I say, farmer.
Yes.
And not only.
He's an enthusiast.
Exactly.
He's a pioneer of mushrooms. They made a great film.
An aficionado. I've seen the film, of course.
Brilliant. Yeah.
The fungus, the magic fungus,
Fantastic
fantastic fungus. Now, one of the questions that I have is that he believes, we don't know, he believes that actually the way we evolve, and let's say from the moment of the time that we are in the gorilla state to the human transcendence. Actually, he was talking about in a podcast, and I'm sure you heard about it, that maybe magic mushroom is the thing that gave us the information from the future, that actually we evolve and we progress to what we are today as a evolution.
Yes, I mean that's.
It may be a theory, but
it's a stone ape theory, isn't it? It's a McKenna's theory, and it's. I mean, the first thing I'll say, it's not crazy. It might seem crazy, but it's not crazy. The second thing I'll say, it's very hard to test.
Of course.
But we approach it from the other direction. We look at the human brain, and we see in the human brain the difference between the human brain and the gorilla brain. The human brain's twice as big. That expansion of the human brain has all come quite recently in terms of evolution. So what has driven that? Could it be that early humans ate mushrooms and the mushrooms made their brain grow big? Well, it's not impossible, because if you look at the most recently evolved parts of the human brain, the bits that make us human, where we do all our thinking and feeling and analysis, etc., they're full of the receptors that psychedelics work on. And we just published a paper wondering, it's a theory paper, perhaps this high density of these receptors in the most evolutionary recent part of the brain has got something to do with why the brain has grown the way it has. Because it's quite eerie that, the more recent the brain, the more of these receptors it has. Yes.
In the beginning, we are all love, it's all okay. Is this reoccurring constantly, or there is a moment where you can make peace and put this ego aside and just feel constantly as one?
Could you ever get to that state of constancy? That's probably with difficulty, and that probably is where masters of transcendental meditation get. I think the fact that you can get there at all with psychedelics is hugely important, because it shows people that it's possible. And the real challenge is how you maintain that ability. And it might be, say, that microdosing or mini-dosing after a trip, plus maybe mindfulness, will help people hold that state in a long time. Now, it also becomes quite important when we're looking at psychedelics for depression.
Yes.
Because if there's a disorder which is seated in your brain that keeps coming back to capture you, it's depression. And we can cut it off with the psychedelic, but over time, weeks, months, somehow it grows back like a weed. And that's one of the things we're really trying to get our head around at present, is where does it come from? Why can't we get rid of it completely? We don't know where it comes from. We don't know why your ego comes back after you've had a trip. It's probably got something to do with the way the brain is. The brain is a fantastic organ, but it isn't quite perfect.
Yes.
It might be one of those little defects, and it makes it, particularly in relation to depression. In evolutionary terms, it's good to be cautious, because people who aren't cautious are dead. So maybe depression's a sort of facet of always being slightly anxious, slightly cautious, slightly defensive. And maybe that's how the brain, one of the drivers of the brain, that cautiousness.
Now, there is always, after the medicine, I don't know, because I'm not a neuroscientist, and that's why I feel like such a little kid in front of you asking you questions, and I'm so happy. I'm so agitated and so excited. It feels like the plant goes inside. It does its job with the brain. And then all of a sudden, the ego goes away or whatever. And it brings the soul together with the brain. And that's for the rest of the trip where it's all about love, God, and everything. So it's the connection between heart, soul, and the brain, and becomes all the physical body with the mental body with the spiritual and the emotional. Is this? Is this? You could say that it's a combination between the brain and the heart. It happens something like that after in the middle of the trip.
Well, yes, I think the soul better than the heart. I mean, the
soul.
Yeah, I think that is what happens. I think the problem with the brain is our brains are far too clever. They manipulate us. They control us. Either directly or indirectly, deliberately or accidentally. When you dissipate them, then yes, you're not. It's no longer putting down the rest of the body, and so you can get that harmony.
Okay.
This is a huge issue. We have been wanting to study Ibogaine for many years, but we've not been allowed to because there is a concern about the heart.
Yeah.
And so when we set up an experiment to image the brain under Ibogaine, we were told we have to have cardiac monitoring in the scanner. That's not an easy thing to do. But we could do that. But it's proved very difficult to get pure Ibogaine for our ethics committee. But I would love to address that question. I think it might be we could help you answer that, but we'd have to do the brain imaging, and we haven't been able to.
It's obvious that Ibogaine works in different parts of the brain. Then it works like, from what I understood, it resets all the receptors. It brings you before the trauma somehow. It's different than the psilocybin. I'm not saying it's better, but it has different.
It's very much less simple than psilocybin. It must be working on more receptors than just the receptors, the serotonin receptors.
In the world of the shamans, they consider that the iboga is like the grandfather. I mean, is the toughest psychedelic supposedly in the world.
Right. Well, 36 hours of a trip is quite tough. That's right.
You must be crazy to do that, first of all. Now, there are so many people experimenting with the DMT or 5-MeO DMT or Bufo-Alvarez. Having this thing of the particle of the God and saying that is releasing in the amygdala exactly what you have in the moment that you are dying. Could you please explain us a bit about it?
Okay, so there are two molecules that are very similar. There's DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT. Now, 5-methoxy-DMT is not made in the body, but it is made by the toad, the Sonora desert toad, and it's made by some plants. But DMT can be made in the body. It can be made in a place called the pineal, which is a little gland at the back of the brain. The DMT experience is quite similar to the end-of-life experience. So people who've died, their heart stopped, and they've been resuscitated, when they come back, they often talk about having had an experience which is very similar to DMT. It's like darkness, a tunnel, light at the end of the tunnel. We did a study. We worked with a group in Belgium, Liège in Belgium, and they've got good ratings of people who've come back from near-death experiences, and we had ratings of people who had DMT experiences, and the overlap was really quite similar. So then people started saying, well, maybe when you're dying, you're releasing DMT in the brain, and that's giving you these experiences. Now, I don't think the pineal can make enough DMT to do that fast enough. I think what's happening is that DMT, and maybe even more 5-methoxy-DMT, is producing a change in the brain networks that what we call hypoxia, low oxygen, causes when you're nearly dying. So I think we're looking at a brain effect, not a DMT-driven brain effect.
Got it. So I think I read that also in UK, you've done a study where you had people under the MRI, and they had experience like rather than 5 minutes, which I tried before what is the 5-MeO, you had them under 1 hour under. So it must have been huge. I mean, like for 5 minutes is too much, but for 1 hour.
No, that was DMT, not.
Oh, DMT, not 5-MeO, which is much lighter, I guess.
Well, we kept it so it was tolerable.
Okay.
That was the key thing. Obviously, because if you have it too high, then you can't scam people because they're
they're scared.
That's right. So we've done more than that. We've done 6 hours.
Wow.
But not tripping.
Not tripping.
And the reason we've done that, you might be interested, because we know that psychedelics can improve brain function and plasticity. They can heal the brain. They can make the brain grow new connections. And we want to see if we can help people recover from stroke.
Okay.
So we don't want to give people who've had a stroke a trip. So what we invented was a 6-hour infusion of DMT to keep people below the trip, but to maximize the possibility of making the brain heal. So we did that in healthy volunteers, and that's worked. And now the studies in stroke are starting.
So what were some of the results? Because I'm very curious. Amazing, huh?
Well, we haven't done the stroke studies are just starting.
Okay.
But
the 6-hour thing, you've done it?
Yeah, you've done it. I mean, people basically, they're pretty stable. They know things are happening. The world is slightly different, but they're just lying there, and things are a bit woozy, and colours are a bit different, and they're just sort of chilled.
In terms of what is like out of all of them, where you've seen the most results with psilocybin or with DMT in terms of depression and anxiety, Dave?
Most of the work has been done with psilocybin.
Okay.
And there are several reasons for that. The first is actually the duration of action is very convenient for people because it's only 4 or 5 hours. So you can bring someone in the morning, and then you can get them ready and do the blood tests, etc. And then you give them a 4 or 5 hour trip, and then it's all over by about 5 in the afternoon, so they can go home. LSD, you have to keep people in overnight because the trip goes on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there's much less stigma against psilocybin. In my country, politicians hate LSD. I mean,
because of the years of the acid and all exactly.
And so it's we had a prime minister called Theresa May, who insisted that we had to put LSD in all our roadside drug testing. We said no one drives on it. He said, no, I want it in there because
you can drive on LSD.
It's just absurd. But that just shows you the hatred. And then DMT, now the DMT effects are quite short. And our theory, and we may be wrong, but our theory was that a 4 or 5 hour psilocybin trip will allow people to spend a lot of time going back into their minds, into their history and their past, making sense of things. Whereas a DMT trip, you really, it's like a bullet.
It throws you up in the sky.
But there are studies now showing that works. So I don't know what's best, but most of the work has been done with either psilocybin. That's about 10 trials in depression now over the world, and I think ayahuasca, there are about 3. So, and those are long. Ayahuasca trip can last for 7 or 8 hours. Now
with the Ibogaine, what I think, not being a scientist or a specialist in this area, I think that maybe Ibogaine could help people also with Alzheimer. Because from what I understood, it can bring you, after every journey, your brain it's younger with 1.5 year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's worth trying.
Yeah.
Because we've got no other treatment for Alzheimer's.
Yeah, it's incredible, and I think that Ibogaine may be able also to help with the ADHD.
Well, it is a funny story.
Because I feel it on myself.
Yeah. I think that's very interesting you should say that. Albert Hoffman also thought that LSD might help with ADHD. But I think he was coming from a slightly different position. It may be you can reset the brain in ADHD. It's a great question. I don't know anyone who's testing it.
Hoffman, what Hoffman said, and I'm sure you know better than me, it's true about maybe not healing the brain of ADHD.
Well, the answer is we should study it more. And that's why we've got to change the legislation. It makes no sense for any country to keep saying these drugs are very dangerous, have no medical value, and addictive. We've got to reschedule these drugs. Because until they're rescheduled, we will not get anything like as much research done as we need.
Do you think we should have an organization or a team in Brussels to fight for this in the European Union to have it everywhere legalized? Portugal is one of the countries that legalized everything.
No, they
decriminalize.
But they don't do any research. We have an organization. It's called Parea.
Okay.
It's called Psychedelic Access for Research European Alliance. I'm the chair of it, and we are meeting all the time with European MEPs trying to get.
I'm a former MEP.
Are you?
Yes, 5 years ago I was. So if I could help in any way, I will be happy to be there too.
Oh, right. Well, thank you. I will be in touch.
Yes.
No, we need this. We absolutely need this because it is wrong that European citizens are denied access to research with these drugs.
And I think, as I've seen now in that medical facility, as in the States, it's a huge problem with Suboxone, Phenantil, fentanyl, and all these opioids. I also believe that in Europe we have a lot of problem with alcohol.
We do.
And also with other type of drugs like cocaine and crack cocaine and anything else. And I think any of these amazing plants could really save us.
Well, the good news is that my government has, at last, after 10 years, given us some money to study psilocybin for heroin addiction.
Wow.
So we're going to start that trial next year. And we're going to take people, we're going to detox them from heroin so they're clean, and we're going to give them a psilocybin trip, and we're going to see if we can maintain abstinence.
What are the last results? Because I've read also from the psilocybin and from the Ibogaine. I read right now in the center, the American government have done a study. 88% of the veteran of wars, in the States, 21 veteran of wars, every day they commit suicide from complex PTSD.
Yeah, exactly.
What were the results in terms of psilocybin for the depression, your latest research?
So, well, what we find is that almost everyone gets a bit better. Some people get very much better. Maybe a quarter of people get cured. They stay well for years. The others, there's a tendency for the depression to creep back. And what I'd like to do now, I'd like to understand that process, but I'd also like to see if we could give people perhaps 2 trips a year to see if we can keep pushing it down. Maybe it will then die. Yeah, the plant allows you to change, but you've then got to take advantage of that. Yeah.
So your recommendation is the integration process. It's extremely important.
Well, I think it's ethically necessary, and our experience is that patients really benefit from it. So we're very keen on, we call it psychedelic psychotherapy, because we think it's important that the maximum benefit will come from the combination. And that isn't surprising, because we know that if you give antidepressants with psychotherapy, they do better than you just give antidepressants alone.
Which are not good at all. But
this is the point. I mean, the idea that somehow you can cure people of 30 years of chronic depression in a minute or 10 minutes with a zap of DMT, it doesn't make sense because as you say, you've got to rebuild your lives. But the great thing is psychedelics make your brain able to relearn new things, new ways of thinking, new relationships, new attitudes, and then you've got to capitalize on that. Otherwise, we can stop. Mark Twain said, well, stopping smoking is easy. I stop every day. But it's carrying on stopping that's difficult. And the same is going to absolutely be true when we were studying addictions. Get people off heroin, stopping them going back on is going to require a whole range of different factors. And maybe psilocybin will help them come up with a new way of
it's about changing your habits. It's about changing maybe the work that you do. It's about changing your environment. It's about changing friendship, social network. It's about changing all your habits that they are destructive and make you go towards that addiction.
Yes, that's right. And of course, on top of all that, you've got the fact that when people are in addictions, the addictions themselves are so traumatizing.
Yeah.
Because people lose their families, they lose their partners, they lose their jobs. So it's not just that they got the drug, they've also got all the catastrophe in their lives.
Now, one of the things that I've seen as an observer, as you see, me being a musician, I'm so passionate about this, and this is not about me getting prepared for this. It's just all the knowledge that I have inside of me. I mean, it's like that's
You've
what
got a lot of knowledge. I must accept that.
That's what I study every day. It's a passion of mine.
But of course, unfortunately, there are personality traits such as impulsivity that predispose to addiction. So, the quick fix. A lot of people turn to drugs as a quick fix for stress, and they may never have ever been in a situation where they've had to think about the long game.
The other way.
Exactly. And so it's critical that we don't pretend it's a quick fix. It's opening a door to another building, another journey, but it's just a start.
And one more thing that I've seen and I've realized while I was there is that most of the people, they talk about their addiction, like their addiction, it came out of nowhere. Let's say to porn, to masturbation, to drugs, to whatever.
Yes.
Not thinking, I mean, I'm a big, huge believer that any type of my depression, my anxiety, my addictions, my former addictions were all basically based on a trauma from my childhood,
right.
on a trauma, on a transgenerational epigenetic trauma, because my family being a family of gypsies and we were like 150 years ago, we were still slaves.
Yes.
So it's obvious that it's inside of me and possible also from a trauma from previous lives or whatever.
Yeah.
But for
I can't
sure,
comment on the previous lives.
but for sure, there must be the trauma that created that, because as I can see my son, or you can see a kid, when he's born, he's full of love and everything is fine.
Exactly.
I mean, things that are happening to him, it makes him feel that parts of him are missing, and then you need to put here drugs, here obsessions, here addictions, whatever. So the people that they think that addiction is just an addiction and it's the root cause of the suffering is not trauma, I think they are it's a misconception, no?
Well, there is no doubt that maybe I'm going to say the majority of people with addictions do have deep-seated trauma, but not all of them. I mean, there are some people that just like cocaine and they get addicted to cocaine, but it's not all escape. But childhood trauma underpins so much of everything, and so that really hits on where we should be doing everything we can to avoid traumatizing our kids, and we're not doing that in the world at present. We're actually, when you look at what's going on in
it's getting worse.
Gaza and Syria, I mean, it's horrible, and the kids are suffering, and there's going to be another 2-3 generations of kids who are seriously damaged. Yeah,
we are more disconnected now than before.
I think we are. I think you are. Yeah, absolutely.
Even though we are coming from generations like you, I'm sure you were raised by parents that they were during the war. Yeah. I was raised by my parents that they were coming, my grandparents, they were coming from the war. And I remember one of the things, not the traumas and the verbal abuse and the physical abuse, but I remember one of the funny things, my grandmother, which I was calling her my mother, was constantly telling me, eat more, because one of her brothers died from hunger, and she was saying, my other brother that was fat didn't die because he was fat, he had from where to lose weight. My entire life I had to fight them being overweight because from a little kid she would put food in my mouth due to her trauma.
So I was the same. So I was born in 1951. We still had rationing in Britain in 1951. So my parents and my aunts and uncles, they would all use their rations to give to me. And I was a big boy. They would always be giving me, because they wanted this generation to survive. Yes, exactly.
Dave, I'm a big believer. I'm a dreamer. People knows me in my country that I'm with the heads in the sky. But my entire life, whatever I wish for, I'm a very powerful manifester, and like in the law of attraction.
You deliver, huh?
Yeah, I really believe that I used to believe until a couple of years ago that maybe in 30 years, for our kids and for the next generation, they're going to go to pharmacy, and rather than finding Xanax or Prozac, whatever, they will find mushrooms, LSD, and anything else to treat themselves. As I can see, the people in the Silicon Valley, the guys that they are a bit ahead of, and also they can afford to help. Peter Thiel, Peter Diamandis, Musk, and everybody, they invest a lot of money in the psychedelics, more than the governments.
Yes, that's true.
I personally believe, and I want to ask you, do you foresee a future that, like, let's say, by as fast as we move also with AI and science, do you believe that, and also people being so open about it, like Deepak Chopra, everybody, all the people from Silicon Valley, all the people, actors, musicians, politicians,
Steve
are
Jobs,
open.
even.
Steve Jobs, everybody. Do you believe that, let's say, by 2030, 2035, we would be able to get rid of all these huge, big pharma in terms of antidepressant and anti-anxiety, and be able to find in the local pharmacy or at the dispensary magic mushrooms and something, and to make yourself not being addicted to drugs?
I hope so. I mean, in a rational world, yes. But actually, I'm beginning to see the world's less rational than it kind of was. You know, things have definitely deteriorated in the last 30 years, haven't they? So I think in some parts of the world it will happen. I mean, I think, you know, places like Oregon, definitely. But I hope it happens elsewhere, but we do have to. People just have to accept that what they're doing wrong is not helpful at present. We need to stop fighting wars, because that just creates so much more trauma, and it's really unfortunate that we've got so polarized as a globe. I mean, it when Khrushchev, no, it wasn't Khrushchev, was it? Who broke up the Soviet Union? Gorbachev. We kind of thought that was it, job done. And what we didn't realise is that there are some right arsehole humans who are in charge of them, who are quite prepared to sacrifice. I mean, we took our eye off the ball, and we've got to make sure we don't, we minimise the damage that can still be done. Because these drugs are powerful, but they can't heal everyone. Much better to prevent and use them for prevention.
At least prevent.
Yeah.
What would take for you and your colleagues, Richard Karl-Harris and everybody in UK, I mean, what are the necessary procedures in order to legalize this in UK? I mean, where are you in terms of the progress?
So we are actively campaigning now to get what's called rescheduling. Now, this happened last year in Australia. The Australian government said, well, we've got all these soldiers killing themselves, we've got all these policemen killing themselves, we've got one of the best healthcare systems in the world, way better than the American veteran system, and it's not working. So why don't we make psilocybin and MDMA available for these people? Because the benefits could be enormous. And what are the downsides? Well, there aren't any downsides, because it's a medicine.
Exactly.
So, and it's been, so they basically, and we want to do the same. We want to reschedule.
So they legalize it in Australia?
They rescheduled.
Reschedule. So it's not anymore Schedule 1?
Yeah, effectively. And we want to do the same in Britain. Reschedule so that doctors can use it, and research will be much facilitated. So I can put my psilocybin alongside my heroin in the pharmacy. Save me a lot of money, that would.
So it will be legal only under the prescription of a doctor for somebody that has really traumatized or CPTSD or PTSD, but not for everyone in the...
I would like it made Schedule 2 for doctors to choose.
Okay.
So I think there are other indications like OCD, pain, that doctors should be able to use it for. So the Australian one is a start, but it is very focal. It's just on psilocybin just for treatment-resistant depression. MDMA just for treatment-resistant PTSD. I would like the UK to reschedule so that perhaps for 50 indications, doctors could use it.
Amazing. Dave, thank you so much. How can they can find you? I guess on the internet, no?
Yeah, well, you can see I'm on the Imperial College website.
Yeah.
You can also look at the Drug Science website, my charity. And you can see about, if you're interested in Europe, Pareia, there's a Pareia website as well. So
in Brussels.
Yeah.
And if some of our people, you have to be a British citizen in order to get access to treatment for major depression, resistant depression, or
So at present, you can only have treatment in Britain if you're in a trial, and we're not doing trials in depression. No one is.
Okay.
We're doing trials in addiction. We can't do everything. So what we're using at present in the UK is ketamine, which is a reasonable alternative to psychedelics. Not as good, but it's best we've got. No, I think if you want treatment, you have to go elsewhere, like the Netherlands.
Got it. Thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate it, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
God
Great
bless
interview.
you, and congratulations for what you're doing. Thank you for saving us.
Well, I'm hoping I'm making a little bit in the right direction.
God bless you. I'm sure the podcast will be greatly appreciated.
Well, let me know when it goes out, and I'll make sure I tweet. All right?
Sure. Vă mulțumesc mult de tot. Ne vedem joia viitoare. David Knight, o onoare să-l am aici și vă mulțumesc și vouă și Doamne ajută. Mult succes!